Hey guys, hope everyone's having a wonderful day. As you know, this is Unit 4, and we are looking at all these different biomes that exist on planet Earth. And today's lecture is going to focus on the boreal forests as well as tundra biomes. So, two biome types are going to be covered in this single lecture. Um, so, without further ado, let's just get started here. So, a little bit of review here. We have terrestrial biomes is a very important term, especially for this unit. We call large biological communities biomes. And obviously, depending on many abiotic factors, we're going to have several different biomes depending on the position you are looking at on the planet. The main two factors that allow us, a lot of predictive power are temperature and precipitation. If you know these two biotic factors, how much it rains on an annual basis, how much, what the average temperature is annually, you can pretty much know exactly what biome you're gonna be looking at. So very two important abiotic factors. And then another term that we talked about is biodiversity, right? All of the species in a single biome represents the biodiversity. So depending on which biome you're looking at, there's going to be different levels of biodiversity. For example, there are unique species we're going to look at today that only exist in boreal forests or tundra ecosystems. However, these biomes are not going to have as much biodiversity as, let's say, tropical rainforests, right? So depending on which biome you're looking at, you're going to have different levels of biodiversity. Usually, almost always, closer you are to the equator, the higher the biodiversity is. And this makes a lot of sense because at the equator, there is a lot of precipitation that allows primary productivity. It allows a lot of plant life, and that bottom-up control radiates up these food webs. The more plant material you have, the more herbivores can live, the more carnivores can live. So here we're looking at colder ecosystems further away from the equator, and you will see these patterns. And we're going to look at some larger patterns along the way, but a general pattern is that the further away from the equator, biodiversity is going to go down. That's not to say there's not amazing adaptations that have been evolved in species that live in these different latitudes. So clearly we have biomes vary with latitude, but also biomes vary with altitude. So we have vertical zonation. This was a key definition last lecture. Vertical zonation. So as you move up in elevation, you will definitely see signs of different biomes, right? You'll see different species assemblages. So we have this great example of vertical zonation. Just traversing 100 kilometers, you see in Fresno, you see plant life that is adapted to an arid ecology, right? An arid desert-like biome. You have Joshua tree, you have all these different cacti and different shrubs that have really long roots to store water and find the scant water. You move up in elevation and you get into grasslands. You move up even more, you get woodlands dominated by deciduous trees. And then you get, this is like halfway in between a deciduous forest. You have grasslands mixed with trees. So we call that biome a savanna, more specifically a temperate savanna. Then you get into just strictly an oak temperate forest. Then you get some conifers. And then finally up here, you pass that tree line, and no trees can actually live this high. So you get these small alpine tundra flowering plants. So as you go up in elevation, you get different conditions. Those different conditions allow different species assemblages, and they actually limit certain species too. So I love this term, vertical zonation. Remember this figure, precipitation and temperature. You know these two factors. You know quite positively what ecosystem, what biome you're going to be looking at. And again, we are looking at boreal forests today, as well as tundra forests, or tundra biomes. So take a look at the shape of these and where they're positioned on this figure. Boreal forests have a quite variable annual precipitation, right? So, from very low precipitation to getting into almost, right, the lower end of tropical rainforest, right? So, it does vary quite a lot when it comes to annual precipitation. Temperature, however, does not vary that much. Boreal forests are going to be pretty far away from the equator, so the average temperature is going to be on the low side. When we look at tundra biomes, these are the coldest biomes. They limit plant growth, they limit animal survival just from temperature alone, and then not to even mention the low precipitation that they get on an annual basis. So very demanding ecosystems. It makes sense that, these biomes down here do not have much biodiversity. Grasslands are going to have higher biodiversity. Deserts too have, generally speaking, lower biodiversity. So deserts, boreal forests, and tundras, we can say, have the lowest biodiversity on the planet, generally speaking. Again, I love looking at this map, decoding it, looking at geologic features, looking at how different biomes interact with their position on the planet. You get these bands of these similar biomes. These, again, we're focusing on boreal forests today, and then tundra ecosystems. So the gray, and you can see this gray is even more northern than these boreal systems. So across Alaska is half and half boreal forest and tundra, very demanding landscape. So really, really cool. Love that. And another figure that we haven't looked yet is this figure showing the map of biodiversity hot spots, right? So you will notice that many biodiversity hotspots lie along the equator, where there are these tropical rainforests. We get also, some patches more northern. And something to understand is that most of Earth's land mass is actually in the northern hemisphere, right? So you don't see this symmetry of biodiversity that mirrors kind of this temperate region, because there just isn't a lot of land at the southern latitude that matches this. So that's something to think about. Most of Earth's land mass, again, is in the northern hemisphere. But even with that, we can see some patterns of biodiversity definitely being largely positioned along the equator, where there is ample sunshine throughout the year and ample precipitation. But that's not to say that there aren't biodiversity hotspots that are further away from the equator in these different unique habitats. Now, what the ecosystems we're learning about are more north of all of these biodiversity hotspots. So we're actually going to focus on biomes that, again, do not have much biodiversity. But before we get into the ecosystem, why should we protect different ecosystems and the species they support? Like, talking about biodiversity, should we put all of our conservation efforts in just these areas to conserve as much, biodiversity as we can? Should we, deforest and utilize and, maximize, the boreal systems and tundra systems, because there's just not enough, there's not a lot of biodiversity there. So why don't we just utilize those positions on the earth for, creating, maybe having greenhouses. I'm thinking about, future generations and how we're going to have to sustain human life. Why not just focus on the biodiversity hotspots? And this is, a fallacy in thinking and a fallacy of conservation. So I have this lichen here, and this is a great example of conservation in the present age. So many of the times, these charismatic species, they get so much more funding than species that are just as endangered that aren't as charismatic, like this lichen, right? Many people don't even know what a lichen is, right? And a lichen is it's a species complex. So it's actually, it's not just a plant, it's not just a fungus, it's actually an algal community associated with a fungal community, and they create this structure, and it's this amazing mutualism. So that's what a lichen is. But you can tell just by looking at it that it's not very charismatic. There's not going to be a lichen species complex that's going to make its way onto some nation's flag. Oppositely, the eagle, for example, is our nation's mascot. So when the bald eagle was hit heavy in the 70s by toxic pollutants that we'll get into in Unit 6, there was this uproar and there was this amazing conservation effort. And since then, the bald eagle is doing really well. Same thing with panda bears, right? Panda bears get millions and millions of dollars for their conservation effort. Because they're charismatic organisms. So this is a fallacy in human thinking and human action, because it doesn't matter what characteristics a species have. If it's endangered, the endangered species, 99% of the endangered species today are endangered because of human activity, right? So because of that, we hold responsibility in protecting these organisms, charismatic or not. Now, another thing is that there are uses for these organisms that we might not even know. There are, some of these organisms, such as lichen, produce antimicrobial or antiviral compounds that we have not even discovered yet. But with that being said, be careful with that idea, because, we shouldn't just save species so we can utilize them, right? That's not right in this time, because that's just like this very egocentric view of the world. Like, if we can't use it, if there's no antimicrobial compounds, then who cares if it goes extinct? So I'm just, kind of talking about these different thoughts and kind of actions that have gone on with current conservation efforts, and just to be more knowledgeable when it comes to protecting and conserving species on this planet. So species, whether they're charismatic or not, should be protected, and whether they have any uses to us, they should be protected if they don't have uses to us as well. So think about those interactions And clearly, like I mentioned, many organisms can provide food and medicines to us, right? These pharmaceutical products derived from developing world plants, animals, and microbes bring more than $30 billion per year. Not to mention the pollinators that we see. So we are trying to protect pollinators that carry out pollination for at the global scale agricultural efforts. These are all these different uses. Biodiversity aids. Biodiversity actually aids ecosystem stability. So if we allow biodiversity, if we allow multiple organisms to live in a biome, that actual biodiversity helps those communities withstand environmental perturbances. The more organisms you have, the higher the biodiversity, the faster those biomes recover. You get seed dispersals that can, repopulate or increase recruitment for certain plant assemblages that bring in those herbivores, that bring in those predators. So if we help maintain biodiversity, we help maintain the resilience and resistance of these different ecosystems. And obviously, besides that, there are aesthetic values. For example, people flock to the West Coast to actually see giant sequoia trees or redwood trees. So there's that aesthetic value, and then there's an existence value. People knowing that there are these amazing organisms out there, it gives them, hope. It gives them this feeling of, this great feeling, knowing that there are these incredible species living. Very gratifying feelings to know that some of these organisms, like the blue whale, for example, the largest animal that's ever evolved on the planet, is living today. The blue whale. Hopefully the blue whales do not go extinct in my lifetime, because I will be very depressed, right? So these existence values, these aesthetic values, very important. And, again, to touch on this, not every organism needs to have a purpose for us to, help conserve them. So ugly organisms, different molds, slime molds, things that you think are gross, the reason they're, struggling is because of human activity. So it doesn't matter. We should help conserve these organisms. So let's now focus on these biomes that have a very limited biodiversity. So here we are looking at boreal forests. And in boreal forests, you can see that there are just 4 months out of the year that are above freezing. The rest of the year is completely frozen. So there's just 4 months of plant growth. And we'll talk about some ecogeophysical interactions in just a bit. But think about that. Only 4 months of plant growth. So that is a main reason why these places are so limited biodiversity-wise, because, there's only 4 months where plants can grow, and what do you eat throughout the year, right? You really have to store up a really ridiculous reserve to actually make it through those cold months. Obviously, hibernation is another adaptation that allows their metabolism to slow, so they don't have to actually eat throughout these non-growing months. But I'm already thinking about adaptations. You get this bell curve, this extreme seasonality, right? Remember this graph when we were looking at temperate forests. When I introduced these graphs, there was a bell curve. If you remember, in Pennsylvania, which, mirrors the biome that we live in, there was a bell curve, but it wasn't this steep, right? It was more like that. So the further from the equator, the steeper this slope is going to be. Precipitation always is greater than evaporation, so these systems are generally going to have enough moisture, especially throughout the growing season. There is enough moisture. That'd be really problematic if during the growing season evaporation exceeded precipitation. So clearly these boreal forests are going to lie north of the temperate zone, and you can see the plants that are going to exist here. They're not deciduous trees, right? You don't go to these forests during this time of year and see beautiful colors. These trees are dominated by conifers. So here's a conifer or a cone-bearing plant. They don't drop their leaves or needles. They actually can photosynthesize throughout the year. So these are boreal trees that dominate boreal forests. Some of these conifers are pines, hemlocks, spruce, cedars, and fir. So these all have needle-like leaf material that do not fall in the autumn and kind of are maintained. They do have they last a few years and then they do fall and have to replace them, but they don't seasonally fall. Animals of boreal biomes. We have several bird species. Again, birds, this is the first time I'm mentioning this, but birds are everywhere. Every biome is going to have some type of bird. Birds, they adapted to every single biome on this planet, and they can easily disperse to these different biomes. So there are bird species, and there are mammals like moose, wolf, and lynx, and there are very few to no reptiles. Now there are some pockets of reptiles that are right on that border between temperate systems and boreal ecosystems, but you readily do not find reptiles. Now there are sometimes there have been amphibians that have really crazy adaptations that have like antifreeze in their body. So those are ectotherms that do sometimes live in boreal ecosystems. But boreal ecosystems, the animals that live there are largely going to be endothermic. Remember, birds and mammals are endothermic. There's going to be very few ectotherms living in boreal ecosystems. So I love this figure. This shows the difference between ectotherms and endotherms. So a snake is an ectotherm, and its body temperature varies with the outside temperature, right? An endotherm can maintain its body temperature in different outside temperatures. So this is a main reason why we do see endotherms living in these extremely cold and demanding places, right? A snake is simply not going to have, its own metabolisms. The activity of its cells will literally come to a halt in these temperatures. So you do not see them there. However, endotherms, inside, organisms that create heat from their inside. And some of you might heard warm-blooded versus cold-blooded, and these are outdated terms, right? Because snakes, they have warm blood because they bask in the sun and warm up their blood, right? So I like to use the term endotherm and ectotherm. Now, there is a downside to endotherms, and that is the energy heating your body up requires. So mammals and birds, they have much higher metabolisms. We require more food more regularly than an ectotherm. So there's some trade-offs for you. So endotherms can live in varying climates with varying temperature because they can maintain their body temp, but they require a lot of energy. Ectotherms, they are more limited to living in warmer climates, but they do not require as much energy. So there are some two trade-offs there. So moving on to tundra ecosystems, you can see that a tundra ecosystem can actually freeze in any month. And this graph actually depicts a just 2 months out of the year where it actually creeps up above freezing. So really, really intense biomes. You can see there's not even trees that can exist here. So this picture was taken actually during the warm July and August months here. So very short growing season. Obviously there's we can't see any animals here. There's not a lot of animals that do live here. So the plants have a very short growing season. And look at the mountains. The mountains are totally barren, right? They're not even that tall, yet because of the northern position of these biomes, just a little bit up in elevation, you have very little to no plant growth. Right? You do see liquid water here, yet, when the sun sets, these ecosystems, they can freeze. So a tundra can freeze in any month. These biomes, you find them at really northern latitudes, as well, obviously, as some southern latitudes, but most of Earth's land mass is in the northern hemisphere, again. And in really high elevation systems. So again, be able to tell me what's going on with this graph. Precipitation never really dips, never really exceeds evaporation. Now, if these, if temperature was higher during the growing season, there actually isn't a lot of precipitation in these biomes, yet the temperatures are not that high, so there just isn't a lot of evaporation. So I want to talk about two ecogeographical rules. So ecogeographical. So eco as ecosystems, and then geographical, so position on the planet. And the first rule that we're going to look at is Bergmann's rule. And Bergmann's, the way I want you to remember this is Bergmann, the B refers to body. So Bergmann and body size. So this rule suggests that the further you are, the further away you are from the equator, the larger the body size is actually going to be. So this makes sense when we look at the bear species on our planet. The smaller bears usually are found closer to the equator, and the further you travel away from the equator, the larger the bear species actually get. The largest bear species on the planet are polar bears. And this makes a lot of sense because the larger you are, the more food you can store throughout those dormant plant seasons, right? So larger animals, there's been a selection towards larger animal size the further away you travel from the equator. So this particular figure shows the different average moose population sizes as you increase in latitude, and the further you traveled away from the equator, the larger the moose populations were. So this has a lot to do with temperature. This has to do a lot with food availability. So Bergmann he postulated that this was solely had to do with temperature. And this makes a lot of sense because the larger you are, the more thermal inertia you have. So basically, a elephant holds on to so much more heat easily than a little mouse. So think about the surface area of that mouse. The surface area can actually exceed, the volume of the actual mouse. So the more surface area you have, the more heat can escape. Larger animals have a smaller surface to volume ratio. And actually on the next slide, I'm going to go over this a little bit, but just know that the larger you are, the more thermal inertia you have, and the more energy efficient this is. Now, other researchers, they actually tried to disprove Bergmann's rule. They didn't think it solely had to do with temperature, but food availability, which also is related to latitude. So we just focused on, these two biomes, and the further you go away from the equator, the smaller that plant growing season is, and the smaller that growing season is, the more food you have to store. So larger animals can actually store more food. So there are many ideas that have to do with this, but all in all, Bergmann's rule has to do with body size. Organisms that are found further away from the equator are usually going to have larger body sizes compared to closely similar related species. The second rule we're going to learn about today, and final rule we're going to learn about, is Allen's rule. So Allen's rule has to do with appendages. So the double L in Allen, I want you to think of bunny ears, because bunny ears are appendages. Also limbs, legs and arms are appendages, and tails are appendages. So Allen's rule has to do with these appendages. And this is a great example. Allen in 1877, so this is very early. This is, a really great observation this gentleman made. He formulated this rule, and he realized that animals that are adapted to cold climates are going to have shorter limbs and body appendages than animals adapted to warmer climates. So these two organisms, obviously, we have a hare and we have I forgot what the actual name is, but we have a rabbit that has adapted a lifestyle in a colder climate. These mammals are from the order Lagomorpha, so they're lagomorphs. And you can see that the hare has these large appendages, right? It has a long tail, these huge ears, and you can actually see, if you look closely, let me zoom in here, you can actually see blood vessels, right? So this is an adaptation you find in organisms that live in warm regions, right? In these warm regions, you get these large appendages, and these allow the organism to dump heat out into their environment. If they didn't have these large appendages, they would get too hot and they would have to stay, immobile throughout most of the day, and their fitness would go down. So their fitness over evolutionary time increased as their appendages grew. The longer their legs, the longer their tail, and the larger their ears, these all increase surface area, which allows heat to leave their body and go into the environment. Oppositely, in colder climates, you can see shorter limbs. So having shorter limbs, having smaller appendages actually conserves heat. So this is Allen's rule, and it's really cool. And just look at here. This is a great representation of surface to volume ratio. So look, we have this cube and this rectangular prism here, they're made up of the same volume, right? So the volume is 8 of these cubes. However, they have much different surfaces. So this organism has this shape has a larger surface to volume ratio compared to this shape. So we can see that, and this has to do with both Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule, right? So surface to volume ratio is a key player in not only these tundra and boreal biomes, but every biome type. So what threatens biodiversity? Well, obviously we have extinction. So the elimination of a species is a normal process of the natural world. We know this from Unit 2. However, human impacts have accelerated this rate recently. We know that 99% of species have all gone extinct. And most of those species were gone before humans came onto Earth's scene. So we know that there are these periodic mass extinctions of species and entire families of organisms. So all in all, it's really important for us to realize these patterns in nature and to realize that, not only should conservation efforts be focused on biodiversity hotspots, but all of the planet's biomes. There is still so much to learn about tundra and boreal forests, but I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture learning about these really demanding environments today, and I hope you're excited to be in Unit 4 with me learning about all of different Earth's biomes. So please be healthy, be happy, be safe, and I will see you guys shortly. Have a good one, guys.